China is accused of detaining more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims. US politicians have called for sanctions against the Chinese officials responsible. There are reports of torture and indoctrination in secret camps. So are the basic religious and cultural rights of an entire people under threat? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashim Ahalbara. The International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances is commemorated by the United Nations on Thursday to remember the tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands, abducted by police or government agents in various countries around the world. Today's Inside Story is focusing on China and the western region of Xinjiang, where United Nations human rights experts say more than 1 million ethnic Uyghurs are being held in what resembles a massive internment camp shrouded in secrecy, a sort of no-rights zone. China denies such camps exist, but says criminals involved in minor offenses are sent to what it calls vocational education and employment training centers to help with their reintegration into society. Most Uyghurs practice Islam and speak a Turkic language that's completely different from Mandarin Chinese. 10 million of them live mostly in the Xinjiang region of western China. Ethnic tensions have risen over the years since 1949 after the communist government encouraged the mass migration of Han Chinese. Uyghurs share ethnic and cultural similarities with their neighbors in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. China says its crackdown in Xinjiang is to protect peace and prevent what it calls terrorism. There have been ethnic riots in recent years and Uyghur separatists have been blamed for several attacks, including one in Beijing's Tiananmen Square in 2013. Let's introduce our panel of experts. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leong, an international and independent China strategist. In Nottingham, in the UK, Andreas Fulda, a lecturer at the University of Nottingham. And in Korntal, Germany, by Skype, Adrian Zenz, an expert on China's minority policy. Welcome to you all. Mr. Andrew, what is happening in the Uyghur area? The UN says this is a forced attempt by the government to change the very identity of the Uyghur people.
I think the problem at the moment is China's fear of separatism. Now, let's face it, separatism is a no-no for any country, including democratic advanced countries like Spain. And think about, sort of Catalonia. But I think in China, it's even more informs more anxiety, because Xinjiang is a large area, and of course it's not just the Xinjiang, the Uyghur people, which is now connected with the Eastern Turkestan terrorist movement elsewhere, but also it would drive separatism movements in Tibet, and also even in Taiwan, let alone Hong Kong and Macau. So I think that China's, the Beijing is absolutely anxious to control the situation. What has caused the problem? If you look at the complexity of all the ethnic groups in China, China is a multi-ethnic country consisting of 56 ethnic groups. Of course, the Han Chinese accounts for more than 95% of the total population, but there are, sort of over 50 ethnic groups, and only the Uyghurs and the Tibetans are causing problems. The rest are living in great harmony with the Han Chinese. Now, the reason is because in recent years, as you highlighted earlier, there was a mass migration of the Han Chinese into Xinjiang, and then the Xinjiang people feel that they are being overwhelmed And also they feel that there's erosion of their culture and access to jobs and so on and so forth. So the kind of measures, suppressive measures, can be counterproductive.
Okay. Mr. Andreas, does the fear of extremism justify putting 1 million people in some sort of detention, forcing them to change their system of beliefs?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you and Al-Jazeera for bringing to your audience's attention the fact that hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs are indeed held in political re-education camps in their homeland, Xinjiang. And I've agreed to come to, onto this show because I believe that facing a situation like that, the community of China scholars cannot remain silent. To answer your question directly, I don't think that any of these measures are justifiable. The kind of response we've just heard from Andrew is indefensible because, of course, separatist movements exist in various countries, but the existence of dissent never justifies such draconian measures. Because what we're seeing in mainland China is basically the implementation of a highly racist policy aimed squarely at an ethnic group where anyone, regardless of his or her political or religious views, can be swept up in these internment camps. And that is a huge problem. It's something that we need to talk about because it's unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Adrian, are we talking here about a push by the Chinese government to contain the rise of what it describes as extremism, or a planned attempt by the government to change the identity of an entire people?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, it is probably both. Both are being conflated. For the Chinese state, any sense of a people being different, and especially a sense of people being religious, it's always been seen with suspicion. The Uyghurs are an ethnic group that have had a different historic and linguistic and cultural identity for a long time. As a matter of fact, very few of them are seriously interested in some kind of independence. But the problem is that the Chinese have long had a sense of cultural distance to these people. Mm-hmm. Therefore, for the Chinese state, in many ways, reducing cultural difference or linguistic difference, and especially reducing or suppressing religious identity, is equivalent to counterterrorism. And that's in many ways what we're seeing in Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Andrew Leong, the Chinese government has said over the past few months that it's basically trying to improve the living standards of the people in the Uyghur area. But here's a problem with this particular approach. I mean, how can you defend some sort of Orwellian Big Brother society in modern times and say that people need to go to re-education centers to be sort of indoctrinated? I mean, who accepts such a policy in these days?
I think there is no doubt that in the so-called inner provinces in China, such as Xinjiang and also Tibet and some of the more remote provinces, the economic development has been phenomenal. I mean, the GDP per capita, the life expectancy, the literacy rates, by all measures, they are improving. But then on the other hand, there is a cultural and ethnic religious divide between the Han Chinese as well as the native groups, particularly in Xinjiang and Tibet, for example. Mm-hmm. Because these are rather remote areas in the past, and so they tend to regard their culture as segregated from the other groups in major ethnic groups like the Han Chinese in China for a long, long time. But nevertheless, it's not as if they were completely segregated. If you look at history, back in even the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty, dating back several hundred years ago, there were already about 30% of the Han Chinese, their ethnic Han group in the Xinjiang province. But then in recent years, the problems of ethnic conflict seem to have flared up because the division between the access to jobs, to markets, has become much more pronounced. And there is even a much larger number of Han Chinese settling in Urumqi and others. And the other problem is, of course, southern Tibet, which is the area which is associated with the Eastern Turkestan movement. And that is linked together with other, terrorist groups elsewhere. And of course, there have been in recent years quite a number of terrorist activities throughout China.
Okay.
And of course, as China grows in national gravitas, is subject to all these perceived threats from the West, including ideology.
Okay.
So that's why there was a feedback of repressive measures.
Okay, Mr. Andreas, are we talking here about, just to further explain the whole issue to our audience, are we talking about ethnic discrimination, religious persecution, or there is more to this particular story about the Chinese government and the Uyghurs?
Sure. I mean, I think when we just listen to Andrew, it's quite clear that we shouldn't be hoodwinked by these kind of phony arguments about development status, etc. The real issue here is that the Chinese Communist Party is using extrajudicial measures to imprison Chinese citizens, because Uyghurs are, of course, Chinese citizens, against its own laws. So, for example, when you read the legal commentary about the situation, there are actually no rules and regulations that justify these actions. The Chinese Communist Party is, of course, not bound by the rule of law. It uses the rule by law to govern China, but there is no constitutional basis or no law that, no Chinese law that allows the indefinite internment of people. Now, of course, there is now a law that exists, which is the counterterrorism law, which allows for what's called educational placement, and that could indeed be indefinite, but anyone who is then placed under such educational placement would have to be indicted first on terrorist charges, go through a legal process of imprisonment, and then after being released from prison, then this could take place. But clearly, 100,000, close to 1 million of Uyghurs who are ending up in these camps, they are not terrorists. They're probably not even close to terrorist sympathizers. So to justify that by any measure is highly problematic.
Okay. Adrian, activists have been saying that, for example, in 2017, 1/5 of all the arrests in China have been made in the Xinjiang region. Could this be an indication that the government has completely failed to find a political way out of the problem, and that's now moving one notch further towards harsh measures?
The government, if we look at this historically, has tried several approaches. In the 1990s and early 2000s, we see a developmentalist approach with the Great Western Development Initiative, with the belief that large injections of funding from the top down would make a profound change in the region. Of course, this has caused many problematic side effects, such as an influx of Han settlers. The next strategy was to bring in Chen Quanguo, a strong man who formerly ruled Tibet, and he recruited tens of thousands, close to 100,000 new police, building thousands of new police stations, installing sophisticated surveillance technology, facial recognition cameras. Now, the interesting thing is this re-education drive represents an entirely new dimension, something that we have not seen in other parts of China on this scale in recent history, not in Tibet either. So this is the next level. And I believe we can only speculate in some ways what the actual reasons are. But I believe that the Chinese government feels you can't just put a policeman next to every Uyghur. They're looking for a long-term solution. What is the long-term solution? It is, as government documents call it, I'm sorry, I repeat this. It is, as government documents call it, seeking a hard change. So the long-term change is to thoroughly change an entire people, resulting, however, in a criminalization of the entire belief system.
Okay. Mr. Andrew, I mean, in theory, Xinjiang is considered an autonomous region with a self-appointed local government. But, you know, everyone knows that the guy who calls the final shot is Chen Chuangguo, the man who has been in Tibet known for his harsh measures and iron fist policy. Many are concerned that the man is trying to completely clamp down on dissent and opposition in the Xinjiang region.
Well, I think this is a vicious circle. The more Beijing is anxious about the separatist movements and the perpetration of terrorist acts and the perceived foreign interference in trying to foment the fragmentation of China, the more Beijing tightens the grip. But that is counterproductive, as I was saying. On the one hand, of course, the economic benefits and infrastructural links with the rest of the provinces would help these remote regions to grow. But on the other hand,
you're talking about
their cultural aspirations, their ethnic.
Mr. Andrew, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but you're talking about the Xinjiang region as a poor area. It has massive natural resources potential. It's a rich region on its own. The problem is not this. The problem is purely about persecution here.
Yeah, as I was saying, these repressive measures are counterproductive, and there is a vicious circle. The more Beijing imposes these measures on a sector of the Xinjiang people, the more they are likely to feel estranged and reactive against the Beijing government. So I think that there's, but on the other hand, there is no way that the Beijing would just let go, because this is an existential threat to the whole country. And in fact, no country would allow separatist movements.
You're talking about 11 million people out of a nation of more than a billion people. I mean, why would this be considered as an existential threat? This should be the core of democracy, respecting the rights of the minorities.
Well,
Andrew.
Well, I mean, if you look at the area of Xinjiang, it is huge. I mean, it is one of the largest provinces in China. And so even in terms of numbers, that may be relatively small percentage. But on the other hand, there is an impact and effect. What about Tibet? And Tibet also, if you look at the number of Tibetan people, the number is not that large. But on the other hand, the province is again huge. And not only in terms of size, but in terms of, as you mentioned earlier, resources and the connectivity of China with the Belt and Road with the rest of the world.
Let's talk a little bit now about the international reaction. This is going to be my question to Andreas. I mean, there's been a report by the United Nations about a few weeks ago. Now, there's this letter by U.S. senators and congressmen saying that there needs to be some strong, robust reaction, particularly imposing sanctions on the individuals, companies, on anyone responsible for the atrocities committed against the Uyghur people. Do you think that the Americans would follow suit and take action?
Well, first of all, Jessica Butke from China File made the suggestion, and I think it's a very good suggestion to U.S. policymakers to make good use of the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows the American government to block the property, the overseas property of individuals who have engaged in endemic human rights abuses and corruption. Now, I would think that the strongman Chen Chuangguo very likely qualifies for being subject to the Global Magnitsky Act. And this is something that could be considered more widely because I think for the international community, whether it's the United States, the European Union, or any other country, to just turn a blind eye to the situation in Xinjiang is not an option. If any one of your viewers are rightly concerned, for example, about the racist immigration policies of the Trump administration, where families are being ripped apart, bear in mind that what's happening in Xinjiang is far worse, that the scope of the problem is far bigger, and that much more families are being ripped apart as we speak. And many of the children of the imprisoned Uyghurs are actually now growing up in Chinese orphanages. And I think that is totally and utterly unacceptable. we have an obligation to speak out about these kind of things. And I think a very practical step beyond government is that people around the world should educate themselves about what is happening in Xinjiang by following the news, for example, by Asia Dialogue from the Asia Research Center, China Dialogue from the University of Berkeley, or China File from the Asia Society, which have been doing excellent work on Xinjiang and bringing information, up-to-date information about the situation on the ground.
Adrian, in a country like China, which has historically been thin-skinned when it comes to international criticism, do you think that if we build up momentum, if there's been a momentum in at the UN, EU, the US, that could pay off or ultimately end up being counterproductive?
Now, on the one hand, there is a possibility that the Chinese position will be hardened by being challenged in an international way. However, we also need to consider that the Chinese are at a time where they're really trying to convince the rest of the world of their progress, of their development, and in a sense of their alternative understanding of the world order. Therefore, the Chinese, I think, are inherently interested in how they're being perceived, especially in the context now of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Xinjiang, of course, is the so-called core hub of the Belt and Road Initiative. Nearly all transport that goes on land routes passes through Xinjiang. A lot of the strategic economic development is happening there. And therefore, I believe if this is being raised internationally in a consistent and systematic way, what's happening in Xinjiang today, I believe this is actually very necessary. And if it turns out to hardening the Chinese position, I still believe it is a risk that should be taken.
Mr. Andrew, we're talking about, at the end of the day, we're talking about China, one of the biggest economies in the world. And many governments are scared to the point of raising this issue with the Chinese government. Is this something that you think could embolden the Chinese government to continue its clampdown on the Uyghurs?
Well, I mean, this is not the first time perceived violations of human rights raised their eyebrows in the West. And in fact, China has been taken to task in many forums, including the United Nations and other venues. But I think that at this particular time, again, raising this question in a more aggressive way against China could feed into this kind of vicious circle, because I think that there is a perception now with the trade war with the United States, with the West raising various concerns about China. There is a perception that the whole world is ganging up against China in more ways than one, economically, financially, militarily, and now ideologically. But on the other hand, it is right and proper for the West to raise these issues. But I think there are many other ways as well to engage the Chinese government, especially through programs or think tanks or academic forums and even cooperation with various NGOs.
Mr. Andreas.
But I think that it's right and proper for this to be raised, but one has got to understand where China is coming from.
We do. Andreas, this is going to be my last question in less than a minute, please. In this strange world, as Andrew Leung was basically saying, where the populists are taking over, where the far-right governments now are emerging, do you think that the minorities will have to wait a long time before they can have their own rights respected?
Well, certainly I think one of the issues is that Chinese citizens, those who reside within the People's Republic of China and those who are living all over the world, they have to pay attention as well. And I think, I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party actually acts in their name. The things that happen in Xinjiang, probably most Chinese people, Chinese citizens are not aware of. If they are aware, I think they would take a very critical view of such government actions. And I think ultimately it will depend on how Chinese citizens view this.
Andrew Leung, Andreas Fulda, Adrian Zenz, thank you very much indeed. Looking forward to seeing you in the near future. And thank you again for watching the program. You can see Inside Story again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahalbala, and the whole team here. Bye for now.